They say the truth will set you free. But they never mention the price of that freedom, or the ashes left behind in its wake. For Elara Thorne, the truth wasn't a gentle key unlocking a door. It was a sledgehammer, poised to shatter the very foundations of the world she had so carefully built. The scene was one of impossible perfection, a tableau meticulously crafted from old money and legacy. Inside the grand dining hall of the Thorne family estate, candlelight danced across polished silver and gleamed in the depths of crystal glasses. The air was thick with the scent of roses and the quiet, oppressive weight of ancestral portraits staring down from the walls. It was the 30th wedding anniversary of her husband's parents, Richard and Beatrice Thorne, and the entire clan was gathered to celebrate. Elara sat beside her husband of 12 years, Marcus, the sole heir to the Thorne corporate empire. She was a vision of understated elegance, a role she had perfected over the years, silencing the whispers about her humble origins with her quiet grace and unwavering devotion. Across the table, her children, 10-year-old Liam and 8-year-old Sophie, sat with perfect posture, their youthful innocence a stark contrast to the rigid formality of the occasion. She caught Liam's eye and gave him a small, reassuring smile. In this gilded cage, her children were her everything, the genuine heart of a life that often felt like a performance. Then, the performance came to an abrupt halt. Marcus stood up. The soft murmur of conversation died away, the tines of a fork scraping against a plate sounding like a thunderclap in the sudden silence. He was handsome, impeccably dressed, but as he looked out at the expectant faces, his own was a mask of cold resolve. He didn't look at Elara, not yet. "I have an announcement," he said, his voice, clipped and devoid of emotion, sliced through the fragile peace. "As of this morning, I have filed for divorce from Elara." A collective gasp, quickly stifled, rippled through the room. Elara's heart stopped. She felt dozens of eyes turn to her, a mixture of pity, curiosity, and malice. She could feel the triumphant chill emanating from her mother-in-law, Beatrice, seated at the head of the table. But the true blow, the one designed not just to end a marriage but to annihilate a life, was yet to come. Marcus finally turned his gaze to her, his eyes as empty and hard as polished stones. Then, his gaze flickered dismissively toward Liam and Sophie, who were now looking at their father with wide, confused eyes. "And these children," Marcus declared, his voice ringing with chilling finality, "they are not mine." The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum that sucked all the air from Elara's lungs. In that single suspended moment, she saw it all. She saw the barely concealed smirk on Beatrice's lips. She saw the calculated cruelty in her husband's stance. She felt the world beneath her dissolve into nothing. Her perfect life, her family, her very identity had not just been questioned. It had been executed, right there, in front of everyone who mattered, with a single, devastating lie. The silence in the grand dining hall was a physical thing, a heavy blanket that smothered all sound and thought. For a moment, nobody moved. The accusation hung in the air, a poisonous vapor, twisting the candlelight into grotesque shapes. Elara's world had narrowed to a single point, the cruel, triumphant glint in her mother-in-law's eyes. It was Beatrice who broke the spell. With the regal calm of a queen ordering an execution, she turned to the household staff standing rigidly by the walls. "Pack a small bag for Mrs. Thorne and the children," she said, her voice like ice. "She will be leaving us, tonight." There were no arguments, no questions. In the Thorne dynasty, Beatrice's word was law, second only to her husband, Richard, and with him ailing upstairs, her power was absolute. Marcus didn't even look at Elara as a security guard. A man who had previously greeted her with a respectful nod every morning stepped forward and gestured towards the door with an impersonal firmness. The humiliation was a hot brand on her skin. She was being dismissed like a disgraced servant. Her movements were robotic. She found herself taking Liam's hand and lifting a sleeping Sophie into her arms. The children were silent, their young minds struggling to process the sudden, terrifying shift in their universe. As she was escorted through the familiar marble hallways of the only home her children had ever known, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in a large, gilded mirror. A ghost stared back at her, a pale, shattered woman in a designer dress that now felt like a costume from another life. The small suitcase waiting by the door was a final insult, a pathetic collection of their lives deemed disposable. The heavy oak door closed behind them, and a moment later, the sound of the bolt sliding home echoed in the cold night air. The final, deafening clang was the sound of her old life ending. Once inside the sterile cocoon of her car, the facade of strength she had maintained for her children began to crumble. "Mommy, where are we going?" Liam asked, his voice small but laced with a budding anger that mirrored his father's intensity. "Why did Daddy say that? He's lying." Sophie just sobbed quietly in her booster seat, her small body shaking. Alara drove, her hands trembling on the steering wheel, with no destination in mind. Each street lamp they passed illuminated the tear tracks on her children's faces, and each one was a fresh stab to her heart. How could she explain a betrayal so profound to a child? How could she explain that the man who was supposed to be their protector had just rendered them homeless and nameless with a few carefully chosen words? As the city lights blurred into a meaningless stream, her mind drifted back, searching for answers in the past. She remembered Marcus from college, charming and brilliant, seemingly unburdened by the colossal weight of his family name. He had pursued her relentlessly, drawn, he'd said, to her warmth and her passion for architecture, a world of creativity and structure so different from his own inherited path of ruthless commerce. He had been her great love story. She, the bright girl from a loving middle-class family, had captured the heart of the Thorne heir. But marrying into the Thorne family was like being absorbed into a corporation. Her identity was slowly, methodically stripped away. Her promising career was the first casualty. "A Mrs. Thorne doesn't work," Beatrice had declared over tea one afternoon, her smile never reaching her eyes. "Your project, my dear, is Marcus and his future children." Marcus had echoed the sentiment more gently, framing it as a necessity, a way for her to fully integrate into their world, a world where wives were ornaments and mothers were vessels for the next generation of heirs. For love, she had agreed. She had traded her blueprints for guest lists, her drafting table for charity luncheons. She had convinced herself it was a noble sacrifice. Now she saw it for what it was, the first step in her complete and total subjugation. The Thorne family wasn't just wealthy, they were a dynasty built on a rigid ideology of bloodline and legacy. Richard Thorne, the patriarch, was a titan of industry from a bygone era, a man who believed his family name was a brand more valuable than any stock or asset. Beatrice was the fierce guardian of that brand, and from the beginning, Alara's blood was deemed insufficiently pure. Her kindness was mistaken for weakness, her warmth for a lack of sophistication. For 12 years, she had endured the subtle digs, the backhanded compliments, the constant, draining scrutiny. She had tolerated it all because she loved Marcus and because she believed, foolishly, that their love and their beautiful children were enough to build a real family within the cold stone walls of the Thorne estate. She now understood that she had never been family. She and her children were merely a temporary investment, a placeholder until a more suitable asset could be acquired. And the clock had been ticking. With Richard's health failing, the final moves of a long and calculated game were being played. The inheritance, a fortune so vast it was spoken of in whispers, was the prize, and she and her children were the acceptable casualties in the war to claim it. A jarring beep from the dashboard pulled her from her reverie. The fuel light was on. Reality came crashing back in. She was driving a luxury SUV with less than a quarter tank of gas, with 2 traumatized children in the back and a single, hastily packed suitcase in the trunk. She pulled off the highway, spotting the lurid, blinking sign of a cheap motel. The lobby smelled of stale cigarette smoke and disinfectant. Behind the plexiglass barrier, a weary-looking clerk eyed her expensive coat and her crying children with detached suspicion. "1 room, 2 beds," Alara said, her voice hoarse. She pulled out the platinum credit card Marcus had always insisted she carry. The clerk swiped it, once, twice. He shook his head, turning the small screen towards her. The words glowed in harsh red letters. Card declined. She stared at it, the plastic suddenly feeling flimsy and useless in her hand. Of course, they wouldn't just throw her out, They would sever every lifeline, ensuring she had nowhere to turn. The expulsion wasn't just a moment of anger. It was a strategy, ruthlessly and efficiently executed. She was officially a nobody, cast out into the darkness with nothing but the ashes of the life she once knew. And as she stood there, under the flickering fluorescent lights, with the weight of her children's fear and her own despair pressing down on her, a new feeling began to stir deep within the emptiness. It was cold, hard, and sharp. It was the beginning of rage. The few crumpled bills Alara found at the bottom of her purse were just enough to pay for the room. The clerk's eyes followed her as she took the plastic key card, his gaze a heavy mixture of pity and disdain that made her skin crawl. The room itself was a universe away from the life she had known just hours before. The air was thick with the chemical smell of industrial cleaner, failing to mask years of cigarette smoke and transient desperation. A cheap, particle-board dresser stood askew, one of its handles missing. The carpet was thin and stained, and the window looked out onto a buzzing neon sign that bathed the small space in a sickly, intermittent pink glow. She locked the door, leaning her back against the cheap wood, the flimsy bolt, a pathetic symbol of security against a world that had suddenly become terrifyingly hostile. For the first time since Marcus had stood up and detonated her life, she was completely, utterly alone with the full magnitude of the disaster. Her first thought was of the children. Liam was trying to be brave, his 10-year-old face set in a stoic mask that was a heartbreaking imitation of his father's. He inspected the room with a false air of authority, declaring it an adventure. Sophie, however, had shed her earlier tears and was now unnervingly quiet, clutching the small velvet rabbit she couldn't sleep without, her eyes wide with a fear she didn't have the words to express. Alara's own heart was a gaping wound, but the sight of her children forced her to function. She smoothed the thin, scratchy comforters on the 2 double beds, her movements slow and deliberate. "Okay, my little explorers," she said, her voice unnaturally bright. "It's like we're camping indoors tonight. Who wants the bed by the window?" She helped them change into the pajamas from their small suitcase, the familiar scent of their lavender-scented laundry soap, a tiny, comforting anchor in a sea of strangeness. She told them a story, a whimsical tale of a queen and her 2 loyal knights who had to go on a secret journey. They were asleep within minutes, exhausted by the emotional toll of the evening. Only then, in the oppressive silence of the motel room, punctuated by the hum of the mini-fridge and the distant rumble of trucks on the highway, did Alara allow herself to break. The tears came silently at first, hot tracks carving paths through the makeup she'd so carefully applied for the anniversary dinner. Then came the sobs, racking, silent convulsions that shook her entire body. She pressed a pillow over her face to muffle the sound, terrified of waking the children. It wasn't just the betrayal that crushed her. It was the sheer, breathtaking cruelty of it. To not only end their marriage, but to publicly disown his own children, to strip them of their name, their home, their very identity. For what? Money? Power? A new, younger wife approved by his mother? The man she had loved, the man who had held her hand as she gave birth to both their children. The father who had taught Liam how to ride a bike and read bedtime stories to Sophie every night that man had never existed. He was a phantom, a carefully constructed illusion, and she had devoted 12 years of her life to loving a lie. Her mind, now a maelstrom of pain and confusion, began to frantically sift through the past, searching for the clues she had missed. The pieces, once benign and unconnected, now clicked into place with horrifying clarity. There was the business trip to Zurich 6 months ago, from which he'd returned with a subtle, unfamiliar scent of perfume clinging to his coat, a scent he'd casually dismissed as a colleague's. There were the increasingly frequent late nights at the office, the hushed phone calls he would take in his study with the door closed. She remembered a conversation a year ago, when she'd tried to discuss their long-term financial planning, and he had patronized her with a smile. "Don't you worry about that, darling," he'd said, patting her hand. "It's complicated thorn business. Your job is to keep this home beautiful." He hadn't been protecting her. He had been locking her out, ensuring her ignorance, making her completely dependent, and therefore completely vulnerable. And then there was Beatrice. Her mother-in-law's words, once dismissed as the bitter remarks of a jealous woman, now echoed in her memory like prophecies. Legacy is a heavy burden, Alara, she'd said once, observing Sophie playing in the garden. It requires the strongest of bloodlines to carry it forward. The emphasis on strongest had been almost imperceptible at the time, but now it felt like a direct threat. Alara saw with blinding certainty that this was not a sudden decision on Marcus's part. This was a long, cold, calculated conspiracy, a corporate takeover of a family, and she and her children were simply liabilities being liquidated. The night stretched on, an eternity of grief and regret. She felt herself sinking, the sheer, monolithic power of the Thorne family pressing down on her, threatening to extinguish the last embers of her will to fight. What could she possibly do? They had all the money, all the lawyers, all the influence. She had less than $100 and a tank of gas. Despair was a cold, heavy weight in her stomach. Then, as she rummaged through her wallet, hoping to find another forgotten bill, her fingers brushed against a piece of thick cardstock tucked into a side pocket. She pulled it out. The card was simple, elegant, embossed with a name in a clean, sharp font: Isabella Rossi, attorney at law. She remembered the woman from a charity gala months ago. Isabella had been fiery, intelligent, and had spoken with a passionate conviction about fighting for the underdog. At the time, Alara had been impressed, taking the card out of polite habit. Now, it felt like a lifeline. She stared at the card for a long time, the pink neon light from the sign outside flashing across the embossed letters. The thought of fighting back was terrifying. The Thornes would crush her. They would use their immense resources to paint her as an unstable, vindictive liar. But then she looked over at the two beds, at the peaceful, innocent faces of her sleeping children. Marcus had not just attacked her, he had attacked them. He had tried to erase them. And the protective instinct that had driven her to comfort them just hours before now hardened into something fierce and unyielding. The grief was still there, a raw and gaping wound, but now it was joined by a cold, clear resolve. She was not just a wronged wife anymore. She was a mother, and she would burn down the world to protect her children. Her hand was shaking as she picked up the cheap motel phone, the plastic cool against her skin. She took a deep, shuddering breath and dialed the number. The longest night of her life was ending. The war was just beginning. The phone rang 4 times, each electronic tone amplifying the frantic beating of Alara's heart. She was about to hang up, convinced it was a foolish, desperate impulse, when a voice answered, crisp and awake even in the dead of night. Isabella Rossi. Alara's own voice was a fractured whisper, the name of her husband the only thing she could manage to push past the lump in her throat. My name is Alara Thorne. My husband is Marcus Thorne. There was a pause on the other end of the line, a silence, not of confusion, but of sudden, sharp attention. The Thorne name was a pillar of the city's financial landscape, a name synonymous with untouchable power. To hear it spoken by a trembling woman calling from a motel in the middle of the night was, for a lawyer like Isabella, the scent of blood in the water. "Where are you?" Isabella asked, her tone shifting from professional courtesy to focused command. "Don't move. Text me the address. I'll have a car there for you at 8 a.m. Be ready." The line went dead. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, a single, fragile tendril of hope pierced through Alara's despair. Someone had answered. The morning light was harsh and unforgiving, exposing the grime and sadness of the motel room. The adventure of the previous night had worn off, and the children were scared and confused. Alara used the last of her cash to buy them juice and stale pastries from a vending machine, the transaction a fresh wave of humiliation. At precisely 8 o'clock, a discreet Blacktown car pulled into the motel's cracked parking lot. The driver, a large man in a simple suit, opened the door for them without a word. His professionalism, a silent assurance that they were, for the moment, safe. They drove away from the wreckage of her new life and towards the city's gleaming financial district. The contrast was dizzying. Just yesterday, she had belonged in this world of steel and glass towers. Today, she felt like an intruder, a ghost haunting the edges of a life that was no longer hers. Isabella Rossi's office was not the sprawling, mahogany-paneled fortress of the Thorne family's legal team. It was a sleek, modern space on the 35th floor, with panoramic views of the city, suggesting a different kind of power, one that was nimble, sharp, and self-made. Isabella herself was waiting for them. She was a woman in her late 40s, dressed in an impeccably tailored gray suit, her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her eyes, intelligent and piercing, took in everything. Ilara's expensive but now slightly crumpled dress, her children's frightened faces, the single, pathetic suitcase the driver had carried up for them. She directed the children to a small, comfortable waiting area with a television and toys, handled by a kind-looking paralegal, before leading Ilara into a glass-walled conference room. "All right, Mrs. Thorne," Isabella said, her voice leaving no room for pleasantries. "Start from the beginning, and don't leave anything out." And so, Ilara told her story. The words came out in a torrent of pain and disbelief, the telling of it making the nightmare real in a way it hadn't been before. She recounted the anniversary dinner, Marcus's cold pronouncement, Beatrice's triumphant smile, the brutal expulsion from her home. As she spoke, Isabella listened without interruption, her expression unreadable, her fingers steepled under her chin. She was not a comforting presence. She was an assessor, a strategist evaluating the battlefield. When Ilara finished, her voice raw, Isabella was silent for a full minute. Ilara's heart sank, fearing the lawyer saw a hopeless case, a pathetic, discarded wife with no resources to fight an empire. But Isabella wasn't looking at a victim. She was analyzing a crime scene. "Your father-in-law, Richard Thorne," Isabella began, her voice precise. "His health is failing, correct? There have been rumors for months about a succession plan." Ilara nodded, confused. "And your prenup, I assume they insisted on one?" Ilara nodded again. "Let me guess," Isabella continued, a flicker of something like admiration for the enemy in her eyes. "It's ironclad if you divorce. But there's a legacy clause, isn't there? Something about a substantial trust for any and all of Marcus Thorne's direct descendants. A trust that he can't touch?" Ilara's eyes widened. It was true. A massive, untouchable trust for his heirs, designed by the old patriarch to ensure the Thorne legacy for generations. Isabella leaned forward, the pieces locking into place. "This isn't a divorce, Ilara. This is a hostile takeover. This has Beatrice's fingerprints all over it. They don't want to just divorce you. They want to erase you. By publicly declaring that the children are not his, Marcus is attempting to nullify the legacy clause. He's not fighting for a bigger piece of the pie. He's trying to steal the whole damn bakery. If he succeeds, he and his mother gain absolute control over the entire Thorne fortune upon Richard's death, with no legal obligation to his own children." The cold, legal logic of it was more shocking than any emotional outburst. This was a plan, meticulously crafted and ruthlessly executed. She hadn't just been betrayed by a husband, she had been targeted by a corporation. A grim smile touched Isabella's lips. The Thornes and their lawyers at Sterling, Finch, and Cromwell, they believe they are invincible. They're arrogant. And that's how we're going to beat them. For the first time, Isabella's eyes warmed with a fierce, predatory light. "I'll take your case." Ilara felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled her. "But I have no money," she whispered. "I can't pay you." Isabella waved a dismissive hand. "Don't worry about my fee. I'll be taking this on contingency, a rather large contingency, 30% of whatever we recover. I get paid when you and your children get what you are owed. And believe me, Ilara, what you are owed is a fortune." The shift in the room was palpable. Ilara was no longer a supplicant. She was a client, an ally. Isabella was already on her feet, pacing as she dictated the first steps of their counterattack. "First, we get you and the children somewhere safe and private. I have a foundation that provides discreet housing for high-profile domestic cases. You'll be comfortable and untraceable." She then turned to her intercom. "Maria, get Judge Patterson on the line for me, and draft an emergency petition to compel. I want a court-ordered paternity test for Marcus Thorne to be conducted by a court-appointed lab with a court-appointed supervisor. No room for error, no chance for tampering. I want it filed within the hour." Finally, she turned back to Ilara. And second, we go on the offensive. The Thorns think they control the narrative. We are going to write a new one. I'm hiring a man named Frank. He's the best private investigator in the business. He's going to dig into every corner of Marcus Thorne's life, every bank account, every late-night meeting, every business trip. We are going to find out who he's been seeing and where he's been hiding the money he's been siphoning off in preparation for this. When Alara walked out of that office an hour later, the city skyline looked different. It was no longer an imposing alien landscape. It was a battlefield. She was still terrified, still heartbroken, but the suffocating despair had been replaced by a cold, clear sense of purpose. She had walked in a refugee. She was walking out a soldier. She had an army, even if it was just one brilliant, ferocious woman, and they had a plan. The safe house Isabella had arranged was an anonymous apartment in a quiet, middle-class neighborhood, a world away from the opulent cage of the Thorne estate. It was clean, sparsely furnished, and blessedly private. Here, behind a nameless door in a building full of strangers, Alara and her children began to construct a fragile new reality. She spent the days creating a semblance of normalcy for Liam and Sophie, a desperate performance of stability in a world that had none. They did puzzles on the floor, watched cartoons, and she cooked simple meals in the small kitchen, the mundane tasks a welcome distraction from the storm raging in her mind. But at night, after the children were asleep, she would sit in the darkness, the legal documents Isabella had given her spread out on the small dining table, trying to comprehend the sheer scale of the war she was about to wage. The silence of the small apartment was a stark contrast to the deafening chaos of her thoughts. A week later, she was back in Isabella's glass-walled conference room. The city glittered below them, a beautiful, indifferent beast. This time, a third person was present. His name was Frank, the private investigator Isabella had mentioned. He was a man in his late 50s, with the tired eyes of a man who had seen the worst of human nature and the sturdy, unassuming build of a retired detective, which he was. He didn't have the polished veneer of Isabella's world. His suit was functional rather than fashionable, and his handshake was firm and brief. He exuded a quiet, methodical competence that was more reassuring than any empty promise. He listened intently as Alara, prompted by Isabella, recounted the key details of her life with Marcus, his routines, his favorite restaurants, the names of his closest colleagues, the country club he frequented. Frank asked few questions, but they were precise. Does he have a regular poker game? A private gym? Any recurring business trips to the same city? He was mapping the patterns of a life, searching for the deviations where secrets were likely to hide. Everyone has a tell, Mrs. Thorne, he said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone. The trick is to watch long enough to see it. Frank began his work immediately, and the first reports trickled in within days. They were delivered in a plain manila envelope, containing only photographs and a single sheet of typed notes. The surveillance began at Marcus's new residence, a sleek, ultra-modern condominium in the city's most expensive district, a place Alara had only ever read about in magazines. Frank's photos were taken from a distance, grainy but clear. They showed Marcus leaving the building in the morning, looking carefree and powerful. They showed him returning in the evening. And then, on the third day, there was a new photo. It showed Marcus leaving the building, but he wasn't alone. His arm was around a woman, his head inclined towards hers as they shared a laugh. She was tall, blonde, and dressed in a style that screamed wealth and confidence. Alara's breath hitched as she looked at the picture. Seeing the betrayal in photographic evidence was a physical blow. This was her replacement, the woman who was living the life that had been stolen from her. She studied the woman's face, a perfect stranger who was intimately tied to the destruction of her family. There was no guilt in her expression, only a radiant, proprietary confidence. "Who is she?" Alara asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Her name is Amelia Vance," Isabella read from Frank's notes. 28 years old, daughter of Sterling Vance, the real estate tycoon. Vance Holdings and Thorne Industries have been competitors for years, but there have been rumors of a potential merger. The revelation landed with sickening weight. This wasn't a sordid, secret affair. It was a strategic alliance, a union of two dynasties. Beatrice must have been ecstatic. Ilara, with her middle-class background, had never been anything more than a placeholder. Amelia Vance was the bride the Thorne family had always wanted for their heir. But the personal sting of the affair, as painful as it was just the surface. Frank's real talent, as Isabella had promised, was following the money. Infidelity is easy to prove, Frank explained in their next meeting, his tone matter of fact. But it's the money that wins the war. Rich men aren't sentimental, but they are predictable. They build a new nest before they abandon the old one. He laid another set of documents on the conference table. These weren't grainy photos, but crisp financial statements and corporate filings. Frank had spent days sifting through public records and using his sources to look into private transactions. He had found a shell corporation, AVM Holdings, LLC, registered just 4 months prior. The name was meaningless, designed to be overlooked. But Frank hadn't overlooked it. He pointed to a line on a filing document. The registered agent is a law firm known for one thing: creating ironclad asset shields for the 1%. His finger then moved to a bank statement he had managed to acquire through a source. It showed a series of wire transfers over the past 3 months, totaling over $5 million. The transfers were coming from a subsidiary of Thorne Industries, one so obscure Ilara had never even heard of it, disguised as consulting fees. The recipient of those fees was AVM Holdings. He was bleeding company assets, Isabella murmured, her eyes alight with a cold fire. Assets that are, by law, part of the marital estate. The final piece of the puzzle was a property deed. AVM Holdings had recently purchased a penthouse apartment for $7 million. The address matched the luxury condominium where Marcus was now living with Amelia. AVM, Frank said, tapping the document. Amelia Vance, Marcus. He put his new life, his new home, in her name and paid for it with your money. Ilara stared at the paper trail, the clean, undeniable proof of the conspiracy. The depth of the deception was almost incomprehensible. This wasn't a man who had simply fallen out of love. This was a predator who had systematically stripped her of everything, planning his exit with the same ruthless precision he would use in a corporate acquisition. The affair was a symptom. The real disease was a chilling combination of greed and a complete lack of a soul. He hadn't just decided to leave her. He had planned, for months, to utterly ruin her, to leave her with nothing while he and his new partner lived in luxury paid for by his lies. The pain in her heart was no longer just the ache of a broken marriage. It was the cold, hard fury of a woman who had been robbed. She looked up from the documents, her gaze meeting Isabella's. The tears were gone, her eyes were clear and steady. The darkness had been breached, and what they had found within was not a simple betrayal, but a crime. And criminals, she knew, deserved to be brought to justice. The documents spread across the small dining table were a testament to a meticulously planned betrayal. The photographs of Marcus and Amelia, laughing as they entered their new home, were a constant, tormenting presence. Isabella's advice had been clear and firm. Stay hidden, stay quiet. Let the legal process and the investigation work. Direct engagement, she had warned, was strategically foolish. It could be twisted in court, used to paint Ilara as unhinged, obsessive, jealous. Ilara understood the logic. She respected Isabella's strategic mind. But logic could not quell the gnawing, visceral need that was growing inside her. She needed to see her. She needed to stand in the presence of the woman who had so casually participated in the demolition of her life, not to plead or to scream, but to understand the nature of the enemy she was facing. It was a reckless impulse, a move born from emotion rather than strategy, but it felt as necessary as breathing. She had to look into the eyes of her replacement to truly know what she was up against. Frank's report was detailed. Amelia Vance had a routine. Every Tuesday and Thursday morning, she attended a Pilates class in a hyper-exclusive studio before meeting friends for coffee at a chic cafe called The Gilded Spoon. It was a place where conversations were held in hushed tones over $5 macarons, a world of effortless luxury. This would be the battleground. The night before, Ilara stood before the small closet in her anonymous apartment. She pushed aside the simple, practical clothes she had been wearing for the past few weeks and pulled out a dress from her former life. It was a simple, dark blue sheath dress of impeccable cut and quality, a garment that spoke of quiet confidence, not flamboyant wealth. She paired it with a classic trench coat and low heels. This was her armor. She would not go to this meeting as a victim seeking pity. She would go as Alara Thorne, a name Amelia was trying to steal, and she would meet her adversary on equal footing. The gilded spoon was just as she had imagined. The air smelled of expensive coffee and baked sugar. Sunlight streamed through the large picture windows, glinting off the polished marble tabletops. Alara chose a small table in the corner, a place where she could observe without being immediately seen. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She ordered a black coffee, her hands trembling so much she nearly spilled it as she lifted the cup. Every woman who walked in made her stomach clench. Then she saw her. Amelia Vance was even more striking in person. She moved with an innate, unshakable confidence, the kind that comes from a lifetime of never being told no. She was greeted warmly by the hostess, her laughter light and musical as she was led to a prime table by the window. She was radiance and entitlement personified. For a long moment, Alara simply watched. She watched Amelia order a green tea with a charming smile. She watched her scroll through her phone, a small, self-satisfied smile playing on her lips. Alara felt a wave of cold clarity wash over her. This woman was not a pawn. She was not a love-struck girl who had been manipulated by a married man. She was a co-conspirator, a willing and eager participant. The fury that had been simmering within Alara for weeks finally burned away the fog of her grief. She stood up, her movements calm and deliberate, and walked towards Amelia's table. "Amelia Vance?" Alara said. Her own voice sounded distant, steady. Amelia looked up, her blue eyes taking in Alara's appearance with a quick, appraising glance. There was no shock in her expression, only a flicker of mild annoyance, as if a servant had interrupted her. "I know who you are," Amelia said, her voice smooth as silk. She gestured to the empty chair opposite her. "I suppose this was inevitable." Alara remained standing. "I'm not here to make a scene," she said, keeping her voice low. "I just needed to ask you one thing. How do you sleep at night, in a home that was bought with money stolen from my children?" Amelia's laugh was a soft, condescending sound. "Stolen? That's such a dramatic, working-class word. There was no theft. There was a strategic reallocation of assets. Marcus was investing in his future. In our future." She took a delicate sip of her tea, her gaze never leaving Alara's. "You have to understand, Alara, this was never personal. It's about fit. It's about legacy. The Thorne name requires a certain kind of strength, a certain kind of bloodline to carry it forward. You were a lovely diversion for Marcus, but you were never going to be the queen. You simply weren't born for it." Every word was a carefully aimed dart, designed to hit Alara's deepest insecurities about her background, her worth. Amelia was not just admitting to the affair, she was justifying it as a natural correction of the social order. "He was bored," Amelia continued, her voice taking on a tone of false sympathy. "He was suffocating in that big old house with a wife who was content to arrange flowers and manage charity auctions. He needed a partner, an equal, someone who understands that a marriage, at our level, is a merger. You were a sweet little starter home, Alara, but a man like Marcus was always going to end up in a palace." Alara felt the sting of the insult, but beneath the pain, something else was happening. The woman's unadorned cruelty was having an unintended effect. It was liberating. It severed the last, lingering thread of nostalgia for the man Marcus had pretended to be. The man Amelia was describing, shallow, ambitious, and utterly heartless, was the real Marcus. And he deserved a woman exactly like Amelia. Instead of shattering, Alara felt a profound and terrifying calm settle over her. The trembling in her hands stopped. She looked at Amelia, truly looked at her, and saw not a rival to be envied, but a hollow, rapacious creature. She saw the pathetic desperation of a woman whose only value lay in her father's name and her ability to attach herself to a more powerful one. The confrontation had been a mistake in a strategic sense, but it was a psychological necessity. She had come here to face the ghost that haunted her, and she discovered the ghost was nothing more than a beautifully dressed ghoul. Alara allowed a small, cold smile to touch her own lips. "Thank you, Amelia," she said, her voice even and clear. "You've been incredibly helpful. You've told me everything I needed to know." The shift in her demeanor for the first time seemed to unsettle Amelia. The confidence in her eyes wavered, replaced by a flicker of confusion. She had expected tears, shouting, a satisfyingly dramatic scene. She had not expected this chilling composure. Without another word, Alara turned and walked out of the cafe, leaving Amelia alone at her table in the sunlit room. As the cool city air hit her face, Alara felt as though she had shed a skin. The pain was still there, a dull, permanent ache, but it was no longer a weakness. It had been transmuted into fuel. She took out her phone and dialed Isabella's number. "Isabella, it's me," she said, her voice devoid of any tremor. "You were right. Speaking to her was a mistake. But I'm glad I did it. There are no more illusions. There are no more doubts. Let's destroy them. Not just Marcus. All of them." The woman who had walked into that cafe was gone. In her place was a queen, not of a gilded society, but of a cold and patient fury, ready to burn an empire to the ground to protect her young. The confrontation with Amelia Vance had been a crucible, burning away Alara's grief and leaving behind the hard, unyielding steel of her resolve. When she next met with Isabella and Frank, the energy in the room was different. The dynamic had shifted. Alara was no longer just the grieving victim at the center of the case. She was an active participant in the War Council, her insights sharp, her purpose clear. Amelia confirmed it, Alara stated, her voice even. This was orchestrated. She spoke about legacy, about bloodlines. She sounded just like Beatrice. Marcus is a willing participant, but his mother is the architect. She's the one we need to expose. Frank leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. Targeting the matriarch is a whole different level of warfare, Mrs. Thorne. Marcus is arrogant, driven by ego and greed. He leaves tracks. His mother, Beatrice Thorne, has spent 50 years in the public eye without a single scandal. She's disciplined, careful, and she operates through layers of influence. She won't have incriminating texts on her phone or a secret credit card. She's old-school evil. Isabella nodded in agreement. Frank is right. To get to Beatrice, we can't use digital forensics. We need human intelligence. We need to find someone on the inside, someone she trusted, who has a reason to betray her. The task seemed impossible. Beatrice's inner circle was notoriously small and fiercely loyal, bound to her by a mixture of fear and financial dependency. Frank spent the next 2 weeks working his network of contacts, digging into the Thorne household's employment records, searching for a crack in the fortress wall. He investigated the chefs, the housekeepers, the gardeners, but they were all dead ends. Then he found it. A small but significant anomaly in the payroll records from 3 months prior. A man named Arthur Kendrick, who had been Beatrice Thorne's personal driver and head of security for nearly 20 years, had been abruptly terminated. The official reason was listed as redundancy. But Frank's instincts told him that a woman like Beatrice didn't make loyal, long-serving employees redundant. She excised them. Frank tracked Arthur down to a modest suburban home, a far cry from the manicured estates he was used to. The man who answered the door was in his early 60s, with the proud posture of a former military man and the weary resignation of someone who had been discarded. He was wary, his eyes full of suspicion when Frank introduced himself. He refused to talk at first, terrified of the Thorne family's reach. "You don't understand," Arthur said, his voice low. "They don't just fire you, they ruin you." But Frank was persistent. He met with him again, this time at a quiet, working-class pub where Arthur felt more comfortable. Frank didn't just offer him money, though he made it clear that his cooperation would be handsomely rewarded. Instead, he appealed to the man's wounded pride, the deep injustice of his dismissal. 20 years of service, Arthur. 20 years of loyalty, of keeping her secrets, and she threw you out like garbage. For what? One mistake? Arthur's story tumbled out. His wife had become seriously ill, and he had needed to take a few days off during a critical week when Beatrice was planning a major charity event. In her eyes, his family emergency was an unforgivable inconvenience, a sign of divided loyalty. He was dismissed without severance, his pension threatened if he ever spoke a word about his time with the family. But Arthur was not just a driver, he was a careful man. Sensing a shift in his employer's temperament in the months leading up to his dismissal, and fearing for his future, he had taken out an insurance policy. For years, he had been a silent witness to Beatrice's most private conversations in the soundproofed luxury of her custom town car. In the final few months, he had started making recordings. Back in Isabella's office, the atmosphere was electric with tension. Arthur had agreed to hand over the digital audio files. The four of them, Elara, Isabella, Frank, and Arthur, gathered around the conference table as Frank connected a small hard drive to the speaker system. "This is from about 4 months ago," Frank said. He pressed play. After a faint hiss, the sound of a car moving smoothly over pavement filled the room. And then, a voice, unmistakably Beatrice's, as clear and cold as a winter morning. She was speaking on the phone to Marcus. "The public humiliation is essential, Marcus. Don't be sentimental. It's not enough to divorce her. You must discredit her and the children completely. The accusation must be so shocking, so fundamentally damning, that our friends and business partners are left with no choice but to side with us. It must be seen as a tragedy that has befallen you." Elara felt the blood drain from her face. She was listening to the premeditated script of her life's destruction. Frank played another track, this one from a week later. "Amelia's father is on board," Beatrice's voice continued, "but the Vance Holdings merger is contingent on you having full, unencumbered control of the Thorne assets. The trust your father set up is a problem. The children, as long as they are legally yours, they are an encumbrance on the deal. You must sever the connection. Legally, biologically, completely." The final recording was the most chilling of all. Beatrice's tone was sharp, impatient, as if scolding a recalcitrant child. "Your father's sentimentality has always been a liability. That legacy clause for his descendants was a moment of weakness on his part, a bourgeois fantasy. This is the only way to rectify it. It is a necessary, albeit unpleasant, business decision. She will be dealt with. The children will be provided for, quietly, but they cannot carry the Thorne name. The line must be pure. How days." Arthur also provided a USB stick containing backups of emails from a tablet Beatrice had occasionally used in the car. They corroborated everything. There were emails between Beatrice and the family's top lawyer, strategizing how to legally navigate the paternity claim. There were communications with a financial advisor about setting up the shell corporations that Frank had already discovered. It was all there, in black and white, and in Beatrice's own recorded voice. A cold, methodical plot to defraud her own son's children of their birthright, orchestrated by their own grandmother. Isabella leaned back, a look of grim triumph on her face. "This is it," she said softly. "This is the key that unlocks their entire empire." She looked at Elara, her expression a mixture of professional victory and personal empathy. "I am so sorry you had to hear that. No one should ever have to learn such monstrous things about their family." But Elara wasn't crying. The confrontation with Amelia had forged her heart into steel. This evidence was simply the final tempering. The pain was immense, a deep internal agony, but her resolve was now absolute. The betrayal wasn't just Marcus's weakness or greed. It was a philosophy, a creed of cruelty passed down from mother to son. They were not just a broken family, they were a criminal enterprise. "This is no longer a divorce case," Isabella declared, her voice ringing with purpose. "This is a civil conspiracy to commit financial fraud and intentional infliction of emotional distress. We have unmasked the matriarch. We have her dead to rights. Now, we plan the execution." The phone call came just after 2 in the morning, a jarring intrusion into the fragile peace of the safe house apartment. It was a restricted number. Elara hesitated, her heart beginning to pound a familiar, frantic rhythm before she answered. The voice on the other end was a hushed, trembling whisper, one she recognized instantly. It was Maria, Richard Thorne's private nurse, a kind, older woman who had always treated Alara with a warmth that was glaringly absent in the rest of the Thorne household. "Mrs. Thorne, I'm sorry to call so late," the nurse whispered, a clear note of fear in her voice. "But you need to know, he's taken a turn, a bad one. He's unresponsive. The doctors say it's only a matter of days now, maybe less." Alara's breath caught in her throat. "And Mrs. Beatrice, she's taken over everything. She's allowing no visitors, not even the other family members. She says she's protecting his peace, but it feels like she's isolating him. It's not right." The line went dead. The message, however, was terrifyingly clear. The countdown had begun. The next morning, in Isabella's office, the atmosphere was charged with a new, frantic energy. The news of Richard's impending death had changed the entire landscape of the battle. "They're in a race against their own father's heartbeat," Isabella explained, pacing in front of the large window overlooking the city. "According to the terms of the Thorne family trust, the will is effectively locked at the moment of Richard's death. Any legal proceeding that isn't finalized by then, like a divorce or a formal challenge to paternity, becomes infinitely more complicated. They need a court judgment that says you are divorced and that the children are not Marcus's before the old man takes his last breath. Otherwise, the existing will, with its ironclad trust for his descendants, remains in force." Alara felt a chill run down her spine. They weren't just wishing for Richard to die, they were actively racing his death, using his final moments as a deadline for their own monstrous ambitions. As if on cue, the Thorne family's legal machine roared to life. What had been a steady stream of legal paperwork became a deluge, a campaign of legal warfare designed to shock and awe. An avalanche of motions landed on Isabella's desk. A motion to expedite the divorce proceedings, citing irreconcilable differences. A motion for an emergency custody hearing, based on a fabricated claim that Alara was an unstable and unfit mother. And dozens of aggressive discovery requests, demanding years of Alara's private financial records, personal journals, even her college transcripts, all in a relentless effort to find anything they could use to smear her name. They were trying to bury her, to exhaust her resources and break her spirit under a mountain of paper. The pressure culminated in a deposition. Alara sat at a long, polished table in a sterile conference room, facing a trio of ruthless-looking lawyers from Sterling, Finch, and Cromwell. Isabella sat beside her, a calm and steadying presence. For 6 hours, they interrogated her. Their questions were a vile mix of condescension and accusation, designed to bait her, to make her cry, to provoke an angry outburst they could use against her. They asked about her family background, implying she was a gold digger from the start. They twisted her decision to be a stay-at-home mother into a sign of laziness. They asked invasive, humiliating questions about her fidelity, forcing her to deny phantom affairs. Through it all, Alara, coached by Isabella, remained composed. She answered every question with a quiet, unshakable dignity, her voice even, her gaze direct. She was no longer the trembling, broken woman from that first night. She was a soldier under enemy fire, and she would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her fall. Meanwhile, Marcus, emboldened by his father's decline and the legal onslaught, grew increasingly brazen. Frank's surveillance reports showed him and Amelia living a life of public celebration. They were photographed at charity galas, at exclusive restaurant openings, and, in one particularly galling set of pictures, they were seen leaving a high-end jewelry store, Amelia flashing a new, ostentatious diamond ring on her left hand. He was behaving not like a man in the midst of a contentious divorce, but like a triumphant king surveying his new domain before the old one had even been buried. His arrogance was staggering, and it was a mistake. He believed he had already won. Amidst the legal chaos and personal attacks, Alara found her thoughts drifting to Richard. He wasn't just a strategic deadline. He was a man she had, in her own way, cared for. He was a difficult, demanding patriarch, but he had shown her moments of kindness that stood in stark contrast to his wife's perpetual frost. She remembered one afternoon, years ago, when Beatrice was away. Richard had found her in the garden with a then 5-year-old Liam, patiently teaching him the names of the different roses. He had watched them for a long moment, a rare, soft expression on his face. "You're a good mother, Ilara," he had said, his voice gruff. "You've given this cold house a heart. You're the best thing that ever happened to my foolish boy." Now, that same man was lying alone in a room upstairs, his final days being curated by the very people betraying his legacy. The injustice of it was a separate, personal ache. "We have to do something," Ilara said to Isabella, the recordings from Arthur feeling like a live grenade in their possession. "We have to leak the tapes, expose Beatrice for what she's doing." The temptation for immediate, satisfying revenge was immense. Isabella held up a hand. "I know it's tempting, but a press scandal is a fire we can't fully control." They would deny, deflect, claim the recordings were doctored. It would become a messy war in the court of public opinion. "We have something far more powerful than a news headline. We have irrefutable proof for a court of law." She leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with strategic brilliance. "No, Ilara, we don't play our trump card yet. We let them think their plan is working. We let them rush their legal motions. We let them get everything they want, right up to the finish line. We let them walk right into the execution chamber and lock the door behind them. The reading of the will, that is our stage, not the media." The decision was made. They would hold their fire. They would endure the legal attacks and wait for the perfect moment to strike. The final phone call came 2 days later. It wasn't the nurse this time, but a sterile, official notification from Isabella, who had been informed by the Thorne family's legal counsel. Richard Thorne, the titan, the patriarch, the architect of a financial empire, had passed away in his sleep. The countdown was over. The race had been run. And in their cold, calculating hearts, Marcus and Beatrice Thorne believed they had won. The king was dead, and the battle for his kingdom was about to begin. The death of Richard Thorne was announced to the world with the somber, carefully orchestrated dignity befitting the passing of a titan. A formal statement was issued, praising his contributions to industry and his unwavering leadership. Condolences poured in from titans of finance, political leaders, and foreign dignitaries. The Thorne family presented a united front of dignified grief, their black-clad figures gracing the front pages of the financial papers. But behind the closed doors of the Thorne estate, the mourning was brief. For Marcus and Beatrice, Richard's death was not an end, but a beginning. It was the removal of the final, sentimental obstacle. It was the starting pistol for the final sprint to consolidate their power and claim their prize. They moved with chilling speed, scheduling board meetings and speaking with estate lawyers, their grief a convenient and impenetrable shield against any outside scrutiny. It was into this carefully constructed facade of mourning that Isabella Rossi chose to throw a grenade. 2 days after Richard's death, while the Thornes were still receiving condolence calls, a court courier arrived at the estate and at the offices of Sterling, Finch, and Cromwell. He delivered a motion, filed by Isabella on behalf of Ilara Thorne and her minor children. It was a petition to the court, not just to compel a DNA test, but to do so on an emergency basis, arguing that Marcus Thorne's public and malicious accusation constituted slander and had caused severe emotional distress to the children, whose legal status and birthright were now in jeopardy following the death of their grandfather. The timing was a stroke of genius. It was an act of legal aggression disguised as a plea for justice. In the war room of the Thornes' legal team, the motion was met with fury. "The audacity of this woman," Beatrice seethed in a conference call, her voice losing its composed veneer for a moment. "To use my husband's death as a platform for her disgusting, baseless claims." Their lawyers, however, were more pragmatic. "Refusing the test now would be a public relations disaster, Beatrice," their lead counsel advised. "It would look like we have something to hide. It would lend credence to her story. We have successfully painted her as a hysterical, jilted wife. We must continue that narrative. We must show that Marcus is the real victim here, a man so certain of her infidelity that he is willing to submit to any test to prove it and protect his family's legacy." Marcus, drowning in his own hubris, found the entire situation amusing. "Let her have it," he laughed, speaking to his mother and their lawyers from his new penthouse. Amelia likely listening at his side. Let her have her pathetic little test. It changes nothing. The board is with me. The assets are being consolidated. Father is gone. By the time her little envelope of results is processed, the war will be over. I'll be in complete control of the company and the estate. What does it matter what some lab report says? It will be irrelevant. He was so confident in his victory, so certain of his own power to shape reality, that he saw the DNA test not as a threat, but as a minor, irritating piece of paperwork on the path to his coronation. He agreed to it without a moment's hesitation, a fatal act of arrogance. The day of the test was a cold, gray morning. The location was a neutral, court-appointed medical facility, a place of sterile white walls and the quiet hum of medical equipment. The air was thick with unspoken animosity. Ilara arrived with 10-year-old Liam, holding his small hand tightly in hers. She had explained to him, in the simplest terms she could, that they were there to correct a mistake his father had made. Liam was quiet, his young face a mixture of fear and a defiant anger that mirrored his mother's. A few minutes later, Marcus arrived, flanked by 2 of his lawyers, looking impeccable in a tailored suit, his expression one of bored impatience. He did not look at Ilara, and he did not acknowledge his son. Liam stared at his father, his eyes welling with tears he refused to let fall. Isabella had orchestrated the procedure with the precision of a military operation. A court-appointed supervisor, a stern, unsmiling woman named Miss Albright, was there to oversee the entire process. She checked all of their photo IDs, her gaze lingering on Marcus's with intimidating scrutiny. Inside the collection room, the protocol was rigid. A technician in a white lab coat took a buccal swab from the inside of Liam's cheek. He then did the same for Marcus. Every step was documented. The swabs were immediately placed into separate, tamper-evident bags. The bags were labeled, signed by Ilara, Marcus, and Miss Albright, and then sealed with numbered holographic tape. The 2 sealed bags were then placed together into a larger, padded envelope, which was then sealed with more tamper-evident tape. Miss Albright took possession of the sealed package, placing it into a locked briefcase which she handcuffed to her own wrist. "The chain of custody is now established," she announced to the silent room. "This case will be delivered by me personally to the lab. The results will be sent directly, by secure courier, to the chambers of Judge Eleanor Patterson. They will not be seen by anyone, including myself, until the judge unseals them in a formal capacity." Marcus watched the elaborate procedure with a smirk, as if observing a quaint but ultimately meaningless ritual. He still believed he was above it, that his influence could penetrate even these sterile walls. He had underestimated Isabella. He had underestimated the system she had so expertly weaponized against him. As he signed the final form, his gaze finally met Ilara's across the room. She saw in his eyes not a flicker of remorse or doubt, only the cold, hard certainty of a man who believed he had already won. Her return gaze was just as steady, a silent promise that his certainty was a delusion. With the procedure complete, they departed, 2 separate families leaving a medical facility that now held the key to their futures. Isabella explained the final step to a shaken but resolute Ilara. "The trap is set. The results will sit, sealed, on the judge's desk. They can't touch them. They can't spin them. They can't even see them. Now we wait for them to make the final move." And the Thornes did just that. The following day, they announced the date for Richard Thorne's funeral, a grand affair that was clearly intended to double as the public transfer of power to Marcus. In the same announcement, the family's spokesperson confirmed that the date for the reading of the will had been set for the day after the funeral. They were moving forward, oblivious. They were walking towards a throne, unaware that they were actually walking towards a scaffold. For Ilara, the hardest part of the battle had begun. The quiet, agonizing wait for the sealed truth to finally be brought into the light. The days that followed the DNA test were the longest of Ilara's life. The silence was a unique form of torture, a void filled with 1,000 anxious possibilities. She maintained a brave face for Liam and Sophie, creating a bubble of determined normalcy within the 4 walls of their anonymous apartment. They built forts out of sofa cushions, had movie marathons with microwaved popcorn, and she read to them every night until their breathing softened into the steady rhythm of sleep. But once they were asleep, the facade would crumble. Alara would pace the small living room, a prisoner of the agonizing weight. The future of her children, their identity, their security, was locked away in a sealed envelope on a judge's desk, and the powerlessness of it all was a heavy weight on her soul. Every time her phone buzzed, her heart would leap into her throat, but it was never the news she was waiting for. The call, when it finally came, was from Isabella. Her voice was calm, but carried an undercurrent of electricity. "It's done," she said, without preamble. "I just received official notification from the court clerk's office. The lab has delivered the results. They are in a sealed file, in the possession of Judge Patterson. The bomb is officially planted, Alara. Now we just have to wait for them to walk over it." The news didn't bring relief, only a tightening of the knot in Alara's stomach. The theoretical endgame was now a tangible reality, waiting to happen. The suspense was no longer a fear of the unknown, but the terror of a known confrontation, rapidly approaching. The world's attention, however, was focused on the spectacle of Richard Thorne's funeral. It was less a funeral and more a state affair, a grand display of the Thorne dynasty's immense power and influence. Alara watched it on a live news stream, a detached and invisible observer of a life she had once been a part of. The cathedral was a sea of black, filled with the city's elite. Mayors, senators, and rival billionaires all came to pay their respects to the fallen king. She watched as Marcus, the grieving heir, stepped up to the pulpit to deliver the eulogy. He was a masterful actor. His voice, thick with feigned emotion, spoke of his father's legacy, of duty, of the heavy burden of leadership he was now prepared to shoulder. He spoke of family, of the importance of unity in times of tragedy, a subtle, coded message to the assembled power brokers that the recent unpleasantness with his wife was a settled matter, a footnote in the grand history of the Thorne family. Beatrice was the picture of tragic dignity, a grieving matriarch in a black veil, her posture ramrod straight. But as the camera zoomed in on her face, Alara could see past the performance. She saw the glint of triumph in her eyes, the cold, reptilian stillness of a predator that had successfully cornered its prey. The news commentators made a point of mentioning Alara's absence, framing it as a final, sad confirmation of the family's irreparable schism. But Alara knew her absence was a statement of its own. It was a refusal to sanctify their lies, a refusal to stand in that cathedral and play a part in their disgusting, hypocritical play. She would not mourn the man whose legacy his own wife and son were so callously dismantling. The day after the funeral, the official summons arrived. It was delivered by a courier, a thick, cream-colored envelope bearing the crest of the Thorne family's law firm. The language within was cold and formal, an official notification for all interested parties to attend the reading of the last will and testament of Richard Alistair Thorne. The location was a deliberate display of power, the main boardroom on the top floor of Thorne Industries headquarters. They were summoning her to their seat of power, to the heart of their empire, to witness what they believed would be her final, official vanquishing. That afternoon, Alara sat with Isabella in the law office for their final strategy session. The conference table, which had once held the scattered, painful evidence of her life's destruction, now looked like a general's campaign map. Isabella had assembled their arsenal. There was a copy of the court order compelling the DNA test. There was the official notification that the results were sealed and in the judge's possession. There was Frank's meticulously detailed financial report outlining the conspiracy of fraud. And finally, there was the small digital recorder containing the audio files of Beatrice's phone calls, their ultimate weapon. "This is how it will play out," Isabella said, her voice sharp and focused. "We arrive. We say nothing. We let their lawyer, Wallace, read the will. He will read the primary document, which, as we suspect, leaves everything to Marcus. On the condition that he has no legal heirs with you, we will let them have their moment. We will let the entire room believe that they have won. Their arrogance needs to be at its absolute peak for the fall to be as devastating as possible." She turned to Alara, her gaze intense. "They will look at you. They will be smug, condescending, perhaps even openly cruel. You cannot react. You cannot give them any emotion. Today, you are not a wife or a mother. You are a client, and you are made of ice. Your power tomorrow will come from your stillness, from the knowledge of the truth we hold, and they don't. Alara nodded, a strange calm settling over her. The fear was still there, a cold knot deep inside, but it was now overlaid with a crystalline sense of purpose. That night, she went through the familiar ritual of tucking her children into bed. She kissed Liam's forehead and smoothed Sophie's hair, her heart aching with a love so fierce it was almost painful. They were the beginning and the end of this fight. Everything she had endured, and everything she was about to do, was for them. She looked at their innocent, sleeping faces, and she knew she could face whatever came next. The grief, the fear, the humiliation, it had all been forged into a single, unbreakable point of resolve. The trap was set, the evidence was gathered, the players were all moving toward their designated places on the board. And tomorrow, in the heart of the Thorn Empire, the war for the truth, for her children's name, and for the soul of a legacy, would finally be over. The top floor of Thorn Industries was a silent, opulent testament to the power of a dynasty. The air was cool and still, smelling of polished wood and old money. As Alara and Isabella stepped out of the private elevator, a wave of icy composure washed over Ilara. This was the heart of the enemy's territory, the place where her fate was meant to be sealed. And yet, she felt no fear. There was only a cold, clear sense of purpose. The boardroom was as imposing as she remembered, a long mahogany table stretching towards a wall of glass that offered a godlike view of the city below. A formidable portrait of Richard Thorn, his eyes seemingly alive with stern judgment, presided over the room. They were all there. Beatrice and Marcus sat at the head of the table, the Queen Mother and the newly crowned king. Beatrice was a vision of bereaved elegance in black Chanel, while Marcus wore a suit so sharp and dark it seemed to absorb the light around him. Seated just behind him was Amelia Vance, a vibrant slash of color in a deep blue dress, her expression a careful blend of demure sympathy and radiant triumph. The rest of the long table was occupied by grim-faced board members and a few distant Thorn cousins, all present to witness the official transfer of power. Alara and Isabella took their designated seats at the far end of the table, a deliberate act of isolation that only served to amplify the tension. A heavy, expectant silence settled over the room as the Thorn family's ancient lawyer, a man named Wallace Finch, cleared his throat and opened a leather-bound folder. "We are gathered today," Wallace began, his voice dry as old parchment, "to hear the final wishes of Richard Alistair Thorn, as detailed in his last will and testament, signed and witnessed on the 10th of May, 2 years ago." He droned on through the minor bequests, donations to museums, small trusts for loyal servants, token gifts to distant relatives. Ilara could feel Marcus's impatient energy from across the room, the barely suppressed glee of a man about to inherit the world. Finally, Wallace arrived at the heart of the document. Regarding the primary assets of the estate, including the controlling interest in Thorn Industries, my entire portfolio of properties, and all liquid assets, I bequeath the following. He paused, adjusting his spectacles. All of the aforementioned assets are to be transferred in their entirety to my sole and beloved son, Marcus Thorn, under the explicit condition that he has no legal issue, born or unborn, with his current wife, Ilara Bishop Thorn. Should this condition be met at the time of my death, he is to assume full and unencumbered control of the entire Thorn estate. The words hung in the air, a death sentence delivered in legalese. It was done. A quiet sigh of satisfaction seemed to pass through the room. Beatrice placed a perfectly manicured hand on Marcus's arm, a gesture of maternal pride and absolute victory. Amelia's mask of sympathy dissolved into a brilliant, dazzling smile aimed directly at Marcus. The board members nodded gravely, their allegiance seamlessly transferring to the new king. Alara felt all their eyes on her, a collective gaze of pity and dismissal. They were waiting for her to break, to cry, to protest. She did none of those things. She simply sat there, a statue of ice. "This concludes the reading of the will," Wallace Finch announced, preparing to close the folder. It was at that moment that Isabella Rossi stood up. "Forgive me for interrupting, Mr. Finch," she said, her voice perfectly calm but carrying an authority that made everyone turn to look at her. But before this will can be executed, there is a significant legal matter of standing and paternity that the court has yet to resolve. Marcus scoffed audibly. "This is a private family matter," he sneered. "You have no place here." Beatrice's eyes narrowed into slits of pure venom. "Remove this woman," she commanded. "That will not be necessary." The voice came from a side door that led to a private anteroom. The door swung open, and Judge Eleanor Patterson entered, followed closely by Frank. In her hand, the judge held a large, sealed manila envelope. The room fell into a stunned, absolute silence. The sight of a sitting judge at a private will reading was so unprecedented that no one knew how to react. Marcus's face, which had been a mask of smug arrogance, was now frozen in a state of shock. "As all parties are present," Judge Patterson announced, her voice resonating with judicial power, "I have been petitioned by counsel to unseal the results of the court-ordered paternity test in this room. At this time, to resolve the matter of legal heirship before the execution of the deceased's will. This court finds the petition to have merit." She walked to the head of the table, placing the envelope down in front of a stunned Wallace Finch. "In the matter of Thorne versus Thorne," she declared, her gaze sweeping the room, "I am now unsealing the official, lab-verified DNA analysis." The sound of her tearing the seal was like a gunshot in the silent room. She pulled out the single sheet of paper, her expression unreadable as she scanned it. The seconds stretched into an eternity. Alara held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was the moment. This was everything. The judge looked up, her eyes landing directly on Marcus. "The analysis concludes, with a statistical certainty of 99.9999%, that you, Marcus Thorne, are the biological father of the minor child, Liam Thorne." She paused, then continued, "And with a statistical certainty of 99.9999%, you are the biological father of the minor child, Sophie Thorne." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. A collective gasp went through the room. The board members' heads whipped around to stare at Marcus, their faces masks of utter disbelief and dawning disgust. Amelia Vance looked as if she had been slapped, the color draining from her face as she stared at the man who had lied to her. Marcus himself was ashen, his mouth slightly agape, his entire body rigid with shock. He looked at Alara, his eyes wide with a horrified, uncomprehending expression. He had been so sure, so arrogant, so utterly, completely wrong. Beatrice was the first to break. Her carefully constructed facade of a grieving matriarch shattered into a million pieces. "No!" she shrieked, her voice a raw, ugly sound. "It's a lie. The test was fabricated. She paid someone off. It was tampered with." "Tampered with, Beatrice?" Isabella's voice was like ice water, cutting through the hysteria. "You seem to know a lot about planning and manipulation." Before anyone could react, Isabella pressed a button on her phone, which she had already connected to the boardroom state-of-the-art speaker system. And then, Beatrice's own voice, cold, clear, and utterly damning, filled the opulent room. "The public humiliation is essential, Marcus. You must discredit her and the children completely. The children are an encumbrance on the deal." As her own words echoed around her, Beatrice's face contorted into a mask of pure horror. The board members recoiled, as if they had been physically struck. At the same time, Frank stepped forward and quietly placed a thick file in front of the lead board member. "And that," Isabella's voice rang out, the final killing blow, "is the proof of a multi-million-dollar financial fraud orchestrated by Mrs. Thorne and carried out by her son to embezzle funds from this company and from the estate you are all here to witness." The room erupted into chaos. Beatrice was now screaming incoherently. Marcus sat frozen, a hollowed-out man, his empire and his life utterly annihilated in the space of 3 minutes. Amelia, seeing the dynasty crumble before her eyes, stood up silently, and with one last contemptuous look at Marcus, turned and walked out of the room, abandoning the man who had just lost everything. Amid the swirling vortex of destruction, Alara remained perfectly still. She looked at the wreckage of the family that had tried to destroy her, at the man she had once loved, and she felt a vast, empty calm. The war was over. The truth had been spoken. and in the heart of their fallen kingdom, she was, at last, free. The chaos in the boardroom was the sound of an empire collapsing in on itself. Beatrice Thorne's shrieks of denial devolved into incoherent, hysterical sobs. Marcus sat like a man turned to stone, his face a blank mask of catatonic shock, his mind clearly unable to process the speed and totality of his own annihilation. The board members, men who had spent their lives navigating corporate takeovers and market crashes, were speechless. Their faces a mixture of disgust and raw, unadulterated shock. They were staring at Marcus and Beatrice not as their leaders, but as criminals, as frauds who had very nearly destroyed the legacy they were all sworn to protect. Amelia Vance had vanished, a ghost of a future that would now never exist. Wallace Finch, the old lawyer who had served Richard Thorne for 40 years, looked at the scene with the weary eyes of a man who had seen too much. His face was etched with a profound disappointment. He had been a loyal servant to the family, but the family he had served was clearly not the one represented by the ranting woman and her hollowed-out son. "Security?" he said, his voice quiet but firm, speaking into the room's intercom. 2 guards entered, their presence instantly grounding the chaos. "Please escort Mrs. Beatrice Thorne and Mr. Marcus Thorne from the premises." As the guards moved toward them, a final, desperate plea escaped Marcus's lips, a whisper to the old lawyer. "Wallace, there must be something." "Wait." Wallace's voice cut through the room again, stopping the guards in their tracks. He looked not at Marcus, but at the leather folder in front of him. "There is one more thing." He reached into the folder and, with trembling hands, pulled out a second envelope. This one was different. It was made of thick, aged parchment, sealed not with glue, but with a dark red wax seal bearing the old Thorne family crest. In Richard's familiar, jagged handwriting were the words, "To be opened by Wallace Finch only, and only in the event of a public paternity challenge initiated by my son, Marcus Thorne, against the children of Alara Thorne." A new kind of silence, heavy with dread and confusion, fell over the room. Wallace carefully broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper within. It was a letter, written in the patriarch's own hand. Wallace began to read, his voice filling the void. "If you are reading this," the letter began, "it means my son has proven himself to be not only a fool, but a coward devoid of honor. A man I do not recognize, and a son I can no longer claim. I have not been blind these past few years. I have seen my wife's venomous ambition, and I have seen my son's spineless greed. I knew of their schemes, of the Vance girl, of the money they moved in the shadows. I knew, with the certainty of a man's own heart, that Liam and Sophie were my blood, my true legacy." The letter continued, each word a posthumous hammer blow from the grave. "This was not a condition in my will to punish him. It was a test, a final, desperate hope that somewhere inside the weak man my wife had molded, there was a remnant of the honorable man I had tried to raise. I gave him a choice: the entire fortune, tainted by a lie that would dishonor his own children, or the integrity of his family. A man who would disown his own blood for money is not fit to lead my company or to carry my name. He has failed the test." Wallace paused, taking a deep breath before picking up a second, more formal document that had been folded inside the letter. "Attached to this letter," he announced, "is a legally binding codicil to the will and testament of Richard Alistair Thorne." He began to read the legal language, each phrase precise and brutal. "The codicil hereby nullified and voided any and all previous bequests to Marcus Thorne. It legally and financially disinherited him, completely and irrevocably. It went on to establish a new primary trust, to be named the Liam and Sophie Thorne Legacy Trust. This trust was to be the sole beneficiary of the entire Thorne estate, every share of stock, every property, every last dollar." The room held its breath. Marcus had not just been disinherited, his children had inherited everything from the grandfather he had tried to convince the world was not theirs. And then, Wallace read the final, devastating sentence, the masterstroke of a dead man who had seen all the moves on the board. The sole executor and trustee of this fund, vested with full and absolute control over all assets, all corporate voting shares, and all financial decisions, until the beneficiaries reach the age of 25, will be their mother, my loyal and trusted daughter-in-law, Alara Thorne. If the DNA result was a bomb, this was the apocalypse. Even Isabella's jaw dropped slightly. Alara felt the floor shift beneath her feet. Marcus finally broke, a raw, animal sound of pure agony escaping his lips. Beatrice simply stared, her mind finally broken by the sheer, Shakespearean irony of their self-destruction. In their obsessive quest to steal the entire kingdom, they had not only lost it, they had gift-wrapped it and handed it to the one person they had tried to cast into exile. The guards finally stepped forward and escorted them out, no longer a king and queen regent, but two ghosts, haunting the ruins of a future they themselves had burned to the ground. In the quiet that followed, the board members turned to look at Alara, their expressions a mixture of awe and profound respect. She was no longer the estranged wife, she was the matriarch. She was the Thorne Empire. She stood up and walked to the wall of glass, looking down at the city that was now, in a way, hers to command. She felt no triumph, no lust for revenge. She felt only the immense, sobering weight of a legacy she never asked for, a duty she now had to fulfill for her children. She looked over at the portrait of Richard on the wall, and for the first time, she thought she understood the stern, lonely man. He wasn't kind, but in his own brutal way, he had been just. They say that adversity does not build character, it reveals it. In the quiet dignity of a wronged wife, a fearsome strength was revealed. In the arrogant cruelty of a greedy son, a fatal weakness was exposed. So never, ever, underestimate the silence of a person who has endured too much. For when they finally decide to speak, their voice can echo the truth from the grave. And when they finally decide to act, their patient justice can bring down empires. Betrayal can shatter a heart, but from those broken pieces, an unbreakable strength can be forged. Join us next time as we unlock another door and reveal the secrets that lie within another seemingly perfect family. Thank you for listening.